She knocked on his door at the edge of a Wyoming blizzard with ice in her lashes and $10 of another man's money torn up in the road behind her. Three brothers opened that door. None of them knew yet that the woman dying on their threshold was the only thing standing between them and losing everything they had ever built. This is how it began. The wind came down off the Wind River Range like something that had been holding a grudge for 1,000 years. It rolled across the high country of Wyoming Territory in December of 1876, and it carried snow so fine and sharp it cut the skin like glass dust. Anything with sense was already bedded down. The wolves had gone deep into the lodgepole pines. The elk had dropped into the valleys. Even the ravens, who usually had an opinion about everything, had tucked themselves into the cliffs and gone silent. And into that wind, into that cold, into that howling, unforgiving dark, a young woman was walking. She stepped down from the stagecoach at Sweetwater's Crossing, with the wind already pulling at her skirts, and she stood there for a long moment staring at nothing. The driver did not help her. He did not even look at her. He had been paid in advance, and there was weather coming, and a man who lingered in open country when the sky turned that particular shade of iron was a man who did not live long. He slapped his reins and the coach rolled on wheels, creaking against the frozen ruts. And within 2 minutes, the sound of it was gone and she was alone. The letter in her glove promised a home. The letter had lied. Her name was Evelyn Ashford. She was 22 years old. She had been a school teacher at Miss Pemberton's Academy for Young Ladies in Boston until her Aunt Josephine had passed in October and the creditors had come through the parlor like crows picking at a field. By November, there had been nothing left. No piano, no pearl earrings, no books her mother had loved. No name even that meant anything to anyone who mattered. She had walked out of the only home she had ever known with one carpet bag and a cameo brooch pinned at her throat, and she had walked straight to the Matrimonial Times office on Tremont Street and placed her hope in the hands of a stranger. The stranger had been a man named Owen Blackwood, who owned 40,000 acres of Wyoming rangeland and the biggest freight contract between Cheyenne and the Dakotas. He had written her 47 letters over 8 weeks. He had written about partnership. He had written about respect. He had written about a woman of education standing at his side when the railroad came through the valley, keeping his accounts reading to him by firelight in the evenings. He had written about building something that would outlast them both. She had believed every word. She had sold what remained of her mother to pay for the passage. And then 1 hour ago, at this very crossroads with the sky already darkening, Owen Blackwood had taken one look at her and said, "She will not do. Too fragile. She will not last a winter. Give her coach fare and be done with it." He had not even dismounted. He had said it to his lawyer, a thin man in a city coat, and he had turned his horse and ridden away without once meeting her eyes. The lawyer had pressed an envelope into her shaking hands. Inside, there had been a single sheet of paper, the termination of agreement, signed and witnessed, and folded behind it a bank draft for $10. Like she was a bill was being settled. Evelyn Ashford stood now at the edge of the empty road, and she opened that envelope one more time in the failing light. She looked at the draft, $10 for her mother's piano, for her grandmother's pearls, for 8 weeks of hope. For the entire distance from Boston to this, nothing of a crossroads at the edge of the world. She tore the draft in half, then in half again, then in half once more until the pieces were too small to hold, and she let the wind take them. They scattered across the frozen road like dirty snow, and within a heartbeat, they were gone. Dignity, she thought, was the one thing they could not sell for her. Then she picked up her carpet bag and she started walking. She did not know where she was going. She knew only that the hotel in Sweetwater Town was 8 miles back the way the coach had come, and she did not have the price of a room. She knew the livery would not take her in. She knew no woman could sleep in a stable in this country and still be called a lady by morning. And she knew the storm was coming, and she knew it was coming fast. So she walked. She walked along the ridge road until the light went out of the sky. She walked while the first flakes turned into sheets. She walked while the sheets turned into a blizzard that erased the mountains and erased the road and erased everything except the next footstep in front of her. Her traveling dress, that proud navy blue wool she had sewn the lace onto herself back in Boston, grew heavy with snow and then stiff with ice. Her fingers inside her gloves stopped burning and then stopped feeling anything at all. Her face she could not feel either. Once she fell to her knees, and it was so tempting to stay there. So tempting. The snow looked almost soft. But somewhere very far off through a break in the howling, she thought she saw a light. One light, yellow, small as a pinprick, high up on the shoulder of the mountain. She got up. She did not know how, and she walked toward it. 4 hours later, she was no longer walking so much as falling forward in the general direction of the light. Her lips were blue. Her lashes had frozen shut more than once, and she had pried them open with numb fingers so she could keep going. The light grew. It became a window. The window became a cabin. And the cabin rose up out of the snow like it had been carved from the mountain itself, low and thick-walled and stubborn, with smoke ribboning from its chimney into the storm above. Her knees gave out 3 feet from the door. She crawled the rest of the way. She lifted one frozen hand, and she knocked. The knock was so weak it barely made a sound. She knocked again. Her knuckles scraped against the heavy pine planks. Somewhere inside that cabin, she thought she heard a ball and then boots and then a man's voice saying something low and sharp. And then the bolt slid, the door opened, and she fell forward into the light. Inside the cabin, 3 men had been getting ready to weather the night. Nathaniel Reckoner, who everyone who knew him called Nate, was sitting at the big pine table by the stove working an old bridle that had taken a bad twist in the fall roundup. He was 35 years old. He had shoulders wide enough to fill a door frame and hands that had known the reins of a Union cavalry horse from the time he was 21 until the war ended at Appomattox in the spring of '65. His eyes were the color of good bourbon held up to lamplight, steady and quiet, and tired in a way only men who had seen too much could be tired. He wore a dark wool shirt rolled to the elbows. There was an old knife scar running clean across his ribs under that shirt. He did not like to think about where it came from. Across the room in the chair nearest the fire, Gabriel Reckoner was cleaning a rifle he had not actually fired that day. Gabriel was 33. He was the tracker in the family, the one who could read a deer trail 3 days old and tell you whether the animal was thirsty or spooked or just old and slow. He had sun-streaked hair and a quiet half-smile that lived at the corner of his mouth, whether he meant it to or not. He rarely spoke first. He rarely needed to. And down in the back of the cabin, in a narrow doorway that led to the lean-to forge, Nate had helped him build 3 summers back. Silas Reckoner was banking coals. Silas was 31. He had auburn hair that curled at the ends when he was sweating over the anvil, and he had a temper that could light a room and then burn itself out 10 seconds later and leave him ashamed. Silas was the wild one. He was also the one who cried at horses put down, though he would fight any man who said so out loud. He had buried a little sister in the summer of '70, and he had not been quite the same since. 3 brothers, 1 cabin, 12 years of winters together at the top of the world since their mother, Sarah Reckoner, had passed of the fever, and their father had followed her into the ground 6 months later from what the men of the valley politely called a broken heart, but which Nate privately called grief that had nowhere to go. 12 winters of silence, of work of each other. No woman had crossed that threshold in all that time. Not once, Dawn. The knock on the door was so weak that Gabriel, who had the sharpest ears of the 3, thought it was a branch cracking under ice. Then it came again. Nate set the bridle down slow. He reached behind him without looking and lifted the Winchester off the peg on the wall. Not because he meant to shoot anyone. In that country, at that hour, in that weather, a man who opened his door without iron in his hand was a man with too much trust in the world. "Who is it?" he called through the pine. There was no answer, only the wind. He slid the bolt, and he opened the door. For a half second, he thought it was a drift that had built up against the threshold. Then the drift fell forward into his boots and became a woman. Gabriel was on his feet before Nate had finished catching her. He crossed the room in 3 long steps and took her weight from his brother without a word, and he carried her to the hearth the way a man carries something that might break if he breathed wrong. Silas came out of the forge doorway, cursing under his breath, not at her, but at the storm, at the country, at anything that would leave a woman out in weather like this. He kicked more wood into the stove and the fire jumped. Gabriel laid her down on the buffalo robe in front of the hearth. Her carpet bag was still clutched in one frozen hand, and Silas had to pry her fingers off it one by one. Nate shut the door against the wind. The bolt slammed home. He stood for a moment with his back to the wood looking down at her, and the 3 brothers were very quiet because whatever they had expected out of that storm, a young woman in a navy blue traveling dress with ice in her lashes was not it. Her skin was the color of skim milk. Her lips were gray. There was frost in her hair, which might have been honey-colored under all that white. She was not moving. Gabriel said low, "She is alive." "Barely." Silas said, "Get the wet off her. Now. Fast. Before the cold finds her bones." Nate said nothing. He crossed the room and pulled one of his own flannel shirts down from the peg, a big, soft thing worn to the color of river clay, and he turned his back before he handed it over his shoulder. Gabriel and Silas worked with the practical, unembarrassed speed of men who had lambed ewes and doctored calves and wrapped each other's wounds for a lifetime. They got her coat off. They got the frozen gloves off her hands. They wrapped her in the flannel, and then in the buffalo robe, and then in every blanket the cabin had to offer, and Silas chafed her hands between his own calloused palms, while Gabriel held a tin cup of melted snow to her lips, a drop at a time. She made a small sound after a while, like a word that had forgotten how to be a word. Nate knelt down beside her. His voice when he spoke was lower than he meant it to be. "Ma'am," he said, "can you hear me?" Her eyes opened. They were the color of cornflowers in June. They were so blue it caught him by surprise, and for a moment Nathaniel Reckoner, who had not been surprised by a great deal in 35 years, forgot what he had meant to say. "Please," she whispered, "I am so sorry. I did not mean to come to anyone's door. I was walking and I saw the light." Silas made a low sound in his throat that was half a growl and half a promise. Silas hated the idea of apologies from people who had nothing to apologize for. It offended him somewhere deep. "You did right," Nate said. "You did right coming here. You rest easy." She closed her eyes again. An hour later, she was able to sit up against the stonework of the hearth wrapped in the buffalo robe, and the worst of the blue had gone out of her lips, and Gabriel had put a bowl of venison stew in her hands and was watching to make sure she took it slow. She took it slow. She was a woman who had been hungry before the brothers could see that, but she was not a woman who let hunger make her graceless. She ate the way she had probably been taught to eat at a proper table in Boston, small, careful spoonfuls, and she thanked them every other bite, whether they wanted thanks or not. "What is your name?" Nate asked finally. "Evelyn Ashford," she said. "Most people call me Evie. Where were you trying to get to, Evie?" She was quiet for a long moment. The fire cracked. The wind threw itself against the cabin walls, and the cabin did not move. "I was trying to get to a man named Owen Blackwood," she said at last. "I came from Boston to marry him. I answered his advertisement in the matrimonial paper 8 weeks ago. We wrote letters. He sent me funds for passage. He promised me a home." Nate had gone very still. Across the fire, Gabriel's half-smile was gone. Silas had stopped breathing on purpose, which was a thing he did when he was about to lose his temper. "And he met me at the crossroads this afternoon," Evelyn Ashford said. "He rode up and he looked at me. He did not dismount. He told his lawyer I was too fragile. He said I would not last a winter. He gave me a paper terminating the agreement and a bank draft for $10, and he rode away." She said it without crying. She said it like a woman who had already done her crying somewhere back on the road and did not have any left to spare. "I walked," she said. "There was no coach. The storm came. I saw your light. Silas stood up so fast his chair scraped. He walked to the far wall of the cabin and he put both hands flat against the logs and he stood there with his shoulders working. Gabriel watched him go and did not follow. Gabriel knew his brother. Gabriel knew that what Silas needed in that moment was a wall in about 30 seconds. Nate did not take his eyes off Evie. "Ma'am," he said, "did Blackwood in any of his letters, did he ever mention the Pacific Land Act?" She blinked. The question had come from a place she did not expect. "Yes," she said slowly. "He did. Twice. He said when the railroad came through the valley, there would be paperwork only a married man could file. He said I would be a partner in that. He said my education would be valuable when the time came." Nate and Gabriel traded a look across the fire that was a whole conversation in half a second. Silas, still at the wall, said without turning around, "Tell her, Nate. She has a right to know." Nate drew a slow breath. "Ma'am," he said, "I am going to tell you something, and I want you to hear it through before you answer. Can you do that?" Evie nodded slow. "Owen Blackwood tried to buy this mountain from my brothers and me 3 times last spring. This ridge, Thunder Ridge, 40,000 acres of valley beyond it that bleed into our water. Each time we said no, and each time he came back with a higher offer, and the last time he came back with a lawyer and a paper, he said the territorial court would enforce whether we signed it or not. We sent him off that last time with an understanding that if he came back again, it would not be with a lawyer who walked away." Evie said nothing. Her eyes were very wide. "The Pacific Land Act." Nate went on, as a federal law that gives the railroad companies extra grants of land when they bring a line through untouched territory. But there is a clause in it about private holdings. If a man is married when the claim paperwork is filed, certain spousal holdings fold into his filing. It gives him weight in the land office. It gives him standing in court. It gives him specifically the right to contest neighboring claims that have any ambiguity in their deed. "Our deed," Gabriel said quietly from across the fire, "has an ambiguity in it. Our mother filed this land in her own name in '61 under the Homestead Act before she married our father. We inherited it through her. There is a clerk's error in one of the transfer papers from Cheyenne. Blackwood found out about it somehow last summer. We have been waiting for him to make his move ever since." Evie's hand had gone slowly to her mouth. "He needed a wife," she whispered. "He needed a wife inside 90 days, Nate said, so that when the railroad filing comes through in February, he would be married, and his claim against this mountain would have weight. I was not a bride," she said. "I was a signature." "You were paperwork," Silas said from the wall. His voice was quiet in a way that meant something was about to break in him if he did not hold it. "And when he saw you at the crossroads, he decided you were not a useful enough piece of paper. That was all." Evie sat very still on the buffalo robe in front of the fire. The flannel shirt of a man she did not know was wrapped around her shoulders. The storm was roaring outside. Her whole life, the piano and the pearls and the schoolhouse on Tremont Street and the 8 weeks of letters and the dream of a partnership in the Western Light, all of it collapsed inward in her chest and became a small hard stone. She held the stone. She did not weep. Then she said the thing that proved to the Reckner brothers, in the first hour of knowing her, what kind of woman had walked through their door. She said, "Then I will not give him the satisfaction of having been useful to him in any direction. Not even as a corpse in a snowdrift he could blame on someone else." Gabriel's half-smile came back small and surprised. "Nate said you can stay here until the storm breaks. There is no question about that. Nobody in this country turns a woman out into weather like this, and if they would, they are not the kind of men you would want to know anyway." "I can work," she said. "I am not a charity. I can cook. I can read. I can keep accounts. I was a teacher at a girls' school before my aunt died." Silas finally turned around from the wall. His eyes were wet, and he did not care who saw it. "Ma'am," he said, "you walk 4 hours through a blizzard rather than take $10 from a man who did you wrong. I do not think any of us are going to worry about you being a charity." The first night they put her in the one real bed the cabin had, which was Nate's, and Nate took the buffalo robe by the stove without a word of argument. Gabriel took the second watch of the fire, and Silas took the first, and the three brothers arranged themselves around her like three large quiet animals around a nesting bird, and none of them slept very much, and none of them said why. Around 2 in the morning, with the wind still howling and the logs of the cabin cracking in the cold, Evie sat up suddenly in the bed and could not remember where she was. Silas was in the chair by the stove. He saw her sit up. He saw the fear in her. "You are safe," he said quietly across the dark room. "You are at Thunder Ridge. You knocked on our door. You are safe." She lay back down. Before she went to sleep again, she said into the dark, "Why are you being kind to me?" Silas took a long time to answer. When he did, his voice was rougher than usual. "Because a man keeps his word, ma'am. And the word of a reckoner, even a word not yet spoken, is that nothing bad gets to happen to you while you are under this roof. That is all." She slept. The storm did not break that day or the next. It held the cabin in its teeth for 3 days and 3 nights, and inside those 3 days and 3 nights, a great many small things began to happen in a great many small ways. Gabriel was the first one to make her laugh. He had come back in from the horse caked in snow, from the crown of his hat to the toes of his boots, and the moment he stepped across the threshold, hold an icicle the length of a finger had fallen off his hat brim and landed with a clink in Silas's coffee cup. Silas had looked up betrayed. Gabriel had said perfectly calm, "That is the closest thing to a tip your cooking has ever earned you, brother." And Evie had laughed out loud before she remembered she was a stranger in a stranger's house, and all three brothers had stopped whatever they were doing to look at her because none of them had heard a woman laugh in that cabin in 12 years, and the sound of it changed the light in the room. Silas made her a small pair of fur-lined mittens overnight in the forge room, out of a pelt he had been saving for a reason he could not have named at the time. He left them on the table by her plate the next morning without a word. Nate was slower. Nate watched. Nate saw the way she sat up straighter when she was tired than most women did when they were rested, and he saw the way she held her grief in two hands and did not spill it. And something inside Nathaniel Reckoner, something that had been frozen since a particular afternoon outside Petersburg in the summer of '64, began to thaw a quarter of an inch at a time. He did not know what to do with the thaw, so he worked. He mended the bridle, he cleaned the rifle, and every so often when she was not looking, he looked at her and his jaw worked once and he looked away. On the evening of the second day, the temperature outside dropped to something that felt personal. Nate said, "Ma'am, you are going to freeze where you sit. I am bringing the bed closer to the stove. No one is going to touch you. No one is going to be near you. But you are not going to freeze in this house while there is anything any of us can do about it." She looked at him across the firelight. "At what point do I start to be afraid of what you will ask for?" she said. "You do not," he said. "That is the whole of it. If a day comes when you walk out the front door and I will personally put you on a horse for wherever you want to go. That is my word." She did not bolt the door that night, and at some point in the coldest hour before dawn, she realized that for the first time since her Aunt Josephine had fallen ill back in October, she was not afraid of what morning was going to bring. On the morning of the fourth day, the storm broke. The wind dropped. The snow stopped. The sky opened and the sun came up over the eastern shoulder of Thunder Ridge and lit the valley on fire with white and gold. That was when Evie saw the riders. They came along the ridge trail from the east, 6 of them black shapes against the new snow. She could see the silver at the bridle of the tall, gray horse in front, and she knew that horse and she knew the man. And behind him, riding at his right shoulder, was a lawman with a star on his coat. She turned away from the window. She put on her blue wool dress, her hands no longer shaking, and she pinned her mother's cameo brooch at her throat. She was going to meet Owen Blackwood as Evelyn Ashford of Boston. She opened the cabin door, and she stepped out into the blinding new snow, and she stood there between the 3 Reckoner brothers as Blackwood reined his horse to a halt 20 feet from the porch. "Miss Ashford," he said, "you have caused me a great deal of trouble." She looked up at him. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, in a voice that carried clean across the snow, "you terminated our agreement in writing yesterday afternoon." I have the paper in my bag. I owe you nothing. Sheriff Amos Hale, riding at Blackwood's right shoulder on a tired bay mare, was 62 years old, and he had been wearing a star in Sweetwater County since the year before the war ended, and he was a distant cousin of the Reckoners on the mother's side, a thing Blackwood either did not know or did not care about. Blackwood held out a folded paper. "Read it," he said. Hale read it slowly. "Nathaniel," he said, "Mr. Blackwood here says the young lady is his intended and that she is here against her will. He has filed a sworn complaint to that effect with the territorial court at Laramie. I am required to ask her directly whether she wishes to return with him." Sheriff Evie said, "I have a paper too. May I fetch it?" "You may." She went inside and came back with her carpet bag and drew out the envelope Blackwood's lawyer had pressed into her hands at the crossroads. Sheriff Hale read her paper twice. Owen Hale said quietly, "This is a termination of agreement, signed by you, witnessed by your own lawyer, dated yesterday afternoon. It releases Miss Ashford from any and all obligation to you. The paper you brought me from the Laramie court is dated a full week ago, which is to say before you ever met Miss Ashford at the crossroads at all, which tells me you filed it on speculation before she even stepped off the stagecoach. The later document controls." Blackwood's smile did not move, but something behind it did. "That paper was given in error," he said. "My lawyer exceeded his instructions." "Mr. Blackwood," Evie said, "I walked 4 hours in a blizzard after you rode away from me. I am not going back with you. A man's word is what he does when the weather turns." Sheriff Hale turned his tired bay mare a quarter step, so he was facing Blackwood Square. "Owen," he said, "the lady is here of her own free will. I have no cause to remove her. I suggest you ride back down the mountain while the trail is still clear." Blackwood's face had gone the color of old ash. "You will regret this, Reckoner," he said, and he was looking at Evie. Nate stepped down off the porch. One step. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, quieter than the wind in the pines, "this lady is not yours to regret at. You are going to turn your horse around and ride back down that trail. Do we understand each other?" Blackwood understood. He turned his horse. Sheriff Hale waited until they were 20 feet down the trail before he touched the brim of his hat 1/2 inch to Nate and rode after them. The arrangement was written out 2 days later on a single sheet of Nate's best paper. Housekeeper and bookkeeper for the Reckoner brothers at $12 a month plus room and board, with a teaching position at the Sweetwater Schoolhouse in the spring term, terminable by either party at 7 days' notice. Nate signed it. Gabriel signed it. Silas signed it. And then Nate put the pen in Evie's hand. She signed it. Evelyn Ashford in the handwriting of a school teacher. The first week at Thunder Ridge, after the arrangement was signed, Evie learned more about the high country than she had learned about the entire state of Massachusetts in 22 years of living in it. Nate taught her the Winchester on the flat stretch of snow behind the barn, with an empty peach tin propped on a fence rail at 30 paces. He stood behind her and showed her how to brace the stock into her shoulder, and he put his hands over hers to correct the angle of the barrel, and his hands were calloused and warm, and they stayed there exactly long enough to correct her and no longer. When the shot went off, the peach tin jumped clean off the rail. "Ma'am," he said, "you are a natural." Gabriel taught her the woods. He took her out on snowshoes and showed her how to read the story the snow was telling. Mule deer doe, coyote, how the mountain had been telling him things since he was 6 years old and how he had listened. Silas taught her the forge. She walked in on him on the 6th evening and watched him work a piece of iron into the shape of a hinge. After a long silence without looking up, he said the thing he had never said out loud to anyone except his brothers. "I had a little sister. Her name was Hannah. She was 14. Some men came through this valley in the summer of '70. Drifters. They killed her. We rode them down 2 weeks later. I was 25 years old, and I did things in those 2 weeks that I have not been able to pray out of myself in 6 years of trying. I'm telling you this because the temper in me is a thing I have to watch." Evie did not say she was sorry. She walked across the forge room and put one hand flat on the stone rim of the anvil beside the finished hinge, not touching Silas, and she said, "My mother died of fever when I was 11. My father drank himself to death by the time I was 14. I have not been able to pray any of that out of myself either. So I do not think you are a man I need to be afraid of, Silas Reckner. I think you are a man who understands." Silas set the hammer down very slowly and not at once. The first Sunday of the second week, Nate put the team in the traces of the wagon. "We are going to the Sweetwater Church this morning," he said. "All four of us, where every mouth in this valley can see us walk in together." A story a woman tells about herself is stronger than a story told for her. The Sweetwater Methodist Church was a small, whitewashed building at the edge of the town, with Reverend Thomas Cole preaching out of it for 11 years. The Reckoner wagon came up the church road, and every head in every wagon turned to watch it. Evie walked up the 3 wooden steps of the church with her chin level, and she sat down in the third row on the right with Nate beside her, and Gabriel at the aisle end, and Silas directly behind her like a wall. In the first row on the left, Owen Blackwood turned his head and smiled a small, cold smile. And sitting next to him in a dress of pearl gray silk with a matching hat that had clearly been ordered from Denver was a woman Evelyn Ashford had never seen before, perhaps 28, a diamond ring on the fourth finger of her left hand that caught the morning light and threw a small, hard star onto the whitewashed wall. Evie went very still. Gabriel leaned his head 1 inch toward hers and said under his breath, "That will be the one he actually wanted, the one his plan was for all along. You were his second choice, Miss Evie, the safe bet in case the first bet did not come through." Evie could not breathe for a moment. The whole shape of the last 8 weeks changed in her chest. Every word of Blackwood's 47 letters had been written in the hope that a different woman would say no, and she had been the fallback. A paper bride on standby. Nate's knuckles brushed the side of her glove. The touch said, "I am here. Breathe." She breathed. Reverend Cole out on the Book of Ruth, and when the final hymn was done, he stood at the pulpit and said, "Before you go, brothers and sisters, Miss Ashford of Boston has asked to speak a few words to the valley. I believe we owe her the hearing." Evie stood up. She walked to the front of the church with her carpet bag under one arm and 47 letters tied with a plain brown string inside it. "Good morning," she said. "My name is Evelyn Ashford. I come from Boston, Massachusetts. I answered an advertisement in a matrimonial paper 8 weeks ago, placed by Mr. Owen Blackwood of this valley. I exchanged 47 letters with him. I sold my mother's piano and my grandmother's pearls to pay for my passage west. I arrived at the Sweetwater Crossroads 11 days ago, and Mr. Blackwood met me there, took one look at me, and told his lawyer I was too fragile for this country. He gave me a termination of agreement and a bank draft for $10, and he rode away, and he left me standing in the road as the storm came in." A sound moved through the pews, not a word, just a sound. "I walked for 4 hours in a blizzard," she said, "and I fell 3 times, and the last time I fell, I saw a light on the mountain, and I knocked on the door of Thunder Ridge. The Reckoner brothers opened their door to a stranger in the dark. They have not asked me for one thing in return that any woman in this room could not ask her own father to give her." She lifted the bundle of letters. "These speak of partnership and of needing an educated wife when the railroad came through the valley this February. I was never meant to be a bride. I was meant to be a signature on a piece of paper that would give Mr. Blackwood standing against his neighbors in a land claim. And when a better signature arrived from Denver in a stagecoach, I became unnecessary, and I was discarded at a crossroads in weather that would have killed a dog." A woman in the fourth row on the left stood up. She was perhaps 30 years old, in a gray dress with patched elbows. Her name was Martha Winfield, and she had been a widow for 18 months, and she had never once in all that time spoken in church except to pray. "I believe her," Martha Winfield said clearly into the silent room. "I believe every word, and I believe the Reckoner boys." She sat down. Old Tom Garrett stood up in the back. Old Tom was 71 years old, and he had held the horse the day Sarah Reckner had filed her claim in 61. "I have known the Reckner boys since they were in short pants," Old Tom said. "Their mother was the finest woman this valley ever saw. If Miss Ashford says she is safe at Thunder Ridge, she is safe at Thunder Ridge." He sat down. One by one, up and down the pine pews, men and women began to stand. Not all of them, but enough. Owen Blackwood stood up too, but not in support. He took the arm of the woman in the pearl gray silk, and he walked her out the side door of the church without a backward glance. The weeks after the Sweetwater church service were the strangest and the most peaceful weeks Evelyn Ashford had ever known. She kept the books for the Reckner brothers, and she found that the ledgers of Thunder Ridge had not been touched since their mother Sarah had died 12 winters back. The numbers in the back of the ledger were in a fine, careful hand that looked so much like her own school teacher script that the first time Evie saw it, she had to set the lamp down and press her palms flat against the table. "Your mother kept these," she said to Nate. "Yes, ma'am. She taught in a town in Ohio before she answered a homestead notice and came out here alone in 59. She was 23 years old. She filed this ridge in her own name in 61 before she ever met my father." "Nate," Evie said quietly, "I would like to find every book your mother left in this cabin." Nate went to a heavy wooden chest at the foot of his bed that Evie had never seen opened. He lifted out 7 books and a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon and a small cloth-bound journal with the name Sarah Reckner pressed into the cover in a young woman's hand. "I have not read it," he said. "None of us have. We did not know how. I will read it with you," she said. They read Sarah Reckner's journal together over the next 3 evenings. And on the 13th page, in the handwriting of a woman writing to herself in the summer of 66, when her husband had been dead 2 months and her boys were 8 and 10 and 12, Evie read aloud, "Nate understands duty. Gabriel understands joy. Silas understands pain. One day a woman will come who understands all 3. Pray she is brave." There was a long silence at the pine table. Silas put one large hand flat over his own face and did not move for a long moment. And when he took his hand away, his eyes were wet, but his mouth was almost smiling. "Mama," he said quietly into the room. "Mama." The next evening, Gabriel and Silas left Nate alone with Evie at the pine table for the first time since the night she had arrived. "Miss Ashford," Nate said, "I'm going to say some things now, and I would like you to let me say them through to the end." "Will you do that?" "I will do that," she said. "I am 35 years old," he said. "I came back to this ridge in 65 with a scar on my ribs and a set of mind that I did not think any woman was ever going to touch again. And then a young woman I had never seen in my life fell through my door out of a blizzard, and she looked me in the eye when she thanked me for a cup of coffee like I was a man whose eyes were worth meeting. 'I am not going to tell you that I love you,' he said, 'because I do not have the right to use that word on a woman I have known for 3 weeks. But if you would ever consider letting a man like me court you properly, I would consider it the highest thing that has ever happened to me.'" Evie looked across the lamplight at Nathaniel Reckner, and she thought about how not one of Blackwood's 47 letters had ever said a thing as honest as the 6 words Nate had just finished saying. "Nate," she said quietly, "I would like you to court me. Properly. With your brothers as witnesses and Thunder Ridge as my home. And you do not have to earn any more of my trust than you have already earned in the last 3 weeks. Because it is yours." Nate closed his eyes for 1/2 second, and he breathed out slow. "Thank you," he said. "That is all. Thank you." They were married under the big cottonwood by Sweetwater Creek on a cold, bright afternoon in the middle of January, with half the valley standing in a half circle in the snow, and Reverend Thomas Cole reading the words of the service in a voice that carried clean across the frozen water. Evie wore her blue wool dress with her mother's cameo brooch at her throat and a spray of winterberry in her hair that Gabriel had walked 2 miles up the creek to find for her. Nate wore his one good shirt and a dark coat that had belonged to his father. Silas stood at his brother's right shoulder and did not blink the whole way through the service. Gabriel stood at Nate's left shoulder, and every so often he looked across the small clearing at Martha Winfield, and Martha Winfield looked back at him, and a thing that was going to take 3 more years to finish, saying itself began to say its first syllable right there in the snow. Nate slid his mother's plain gold ring onto her finger, and it fit like it had been waiting there for 22 years. The door of the cabin closed softly behind them that evening, while the last of the wedding guests were still rolling their wagons home through the snow. The fire was built up, the lamp was turned low, and for the first time in 12 years, the cabin on Thunder Ridge belonged to a husband and a wife. What passed between them that night was not for anyone else to see. It was the quiet and the tenderness and the earned trust of two people who had each thought in different ways that they were not going to be allowed this kind of grace in this life. Outside, the first soft snow of the new week began to fall over the high country, and Thunder Ridge gathered itself around them, and they slept. The barn was on fire when Gabriel saw it. It was 2 hours before dawn. He had gone out to check on the foaling mare, and he saw the orange glow through the boards of the big hay barn, and he started to run yelling before his boots were halfway across the snow. Nate came out of the cabin in his stocking feet with the Winchester in one hand and a bucket in the other. Silas came out of the forge lean-to with 2 more buckets. Evie came out in her nightdress and her wool shawl. The hay barn was already gone. Nate made the decision without hesitating. Save the cabin, he said. Save the house barn. Let the hay go. They moved. Silas went up the ladder under the roof of the main cabin with wet blankets. Gabriel took an axe and cut a fire break along the north wall. Evie ran the bucket line alone at first, from the hole they had cut in the creek ice, and then one by one lanterns came up the ridge trail in the dark because the whole valley had seen the glow. Old Tom Garrett came. Martha Winfield came on her dead husband's old plow horse. Reverend Cole came on foot with a shovel. Within an hour, the bucket line was 20 people long, and Evie was at the center of it, calling the rhythm, the way a school teacher calls a lesson hand and pass and hand and pass, and the line held. The hay barn fell in on itself with a great sigh, and the cabin and the house barn and the forge stood. Gabriel came back up the ridge trail out of the trees on the east side with a figure being dragged behind him. The figure was a man in a torn dark coat, and his hands were tied. His name was Jasper Colt. He had been one of the 4 hired men at Blackwood's shoulder the morning Blackwood had ridden up the trail with Sheriff Hale. He smelled of kerosene. Silas walked across the yard to where Jasper Colt was kneeling in the snow, and Silas put one calloused hand very gently on top of Colt's head. Brother Silas said very quietly, "You are going to answer my brother's question, because my wife of 1D almost lost her home tonight." Jasper Colt looked up at Silas, and something in his face changed. "Blackwood," he said. "It was Blackwood. He paid me $40 in gold. That is all I know. I swear on my mother." Nate sent Gabriel and Silas to ride Colt down to Sheriff Hale's office in Sweetwater. They did not come back for 4 hours. When they came back, Gabriel said, "Flat, Colt is dead." "What?" "We delivered him to Sheriff Hale alive at 5:15 this morning. Hale put him in the single cell and locked the door. Silas and I went to the hotel for coffee, and we came back at 6:30. The cell door was still locked. Jasper Colt was hanging from the bars with a strip of his own shirt around his neck. Hale says it was suicide, but Hale also said very quietly just to me and Silas in the back of his office that in 12 years of wearing a star in this county and 30 more as a deputy marshal in Texas before that, he has never once seen a man hang himself with his hands tied behind his back. "Blackwood has a man inside the sheriff's office," Gabriel said. "It does not matter which. What matters is that Colt is not alive to testify, and Blackwood knows it." Nate turned to Evie. He took her cold hand in his cold hand. "Mrs. Reckoner," he said, and it was the first time he had called her that. "Owen Blackwood is not going to stop. He is going to come himself, and he is going to come with more men than Colt. He has maybe 2 weeks. He might have 1. I have a choice to ask of you," he said. "I can put you on a train east tomorrow, out of Laramie under a false name, or you can stay at Thunder Ridge with me and my brothers. I am not going to ask you to stay. I am going to ask you to choose." Evie looked down at the gold ring on her finger. at the burnt edge of her nightdress hem, at her bare feet on the porch boards. I did not walk 4 hours through a blizzard, she said, and I did not stand up in the Sweetwater Church in front of Owen Blackwood and his pearl gray lady, so that I could leave this ridge on a train the first time a man with money tried to frighten me off it. I am staying. And when he comes, Mr. Reckoner, he is going to find a woman on this porch with a Winchester in her hands that her husband taught her to shoot. Silas, standing at the bottom of the porch steps with tears cutting tracks through the soot on his cheeks, said, "Ma'am, I'm going to spend the rest of my natural life being proud that I am kin to you." And on the high porch of Thunder Ridge, the four of them stood together and waited for whatever Owen Blackwood was going to send up that trail next. And none of them, not one, was afraid of it. The fire in Silas Reckoner's blood did not show itself for 12 days. That was the cruel trick of a burn that had gone deep. A man walked around on it. A man worked on it. The red mark on his shoulder scabbed over and looked from the outside like the sort of thing a frontier man dealt with between breakfast and supper. On the 13th morning, after the fire, Silas did not come down for coffee. Evie was the one who noticed first. When 5:15 came and went, she set the rolling pin down slow, and she looked across the room at Nate. Silas is not up. Nate went up the steps 2 at a time. He was back down in under a minute, and the look on his face made Gabriel set his coffee cup down without finishing the sip he had started. "He is burning up," Nate said. "The burn on his shoulder has gone bad underneath. He is asking for Mama." Evie climbed the loft steps with a basin of cool water. His shoulder, when she peeled back the shirt, was a color no living skin should ever be. The redness had gone out in streaks under the collarbone and down toward the heart. She had seen this once before. Her father had died of a cut on his leg that had gone the same way. She had been 14. "Nate," she said, very calm, "we need quinine and carbolic and whatever the doctor in Laramie keeps for blood fever. We need it by tomorrow morning or we are going to lose him." "Laramie is 80 miles, Gabriel said quietly. "In this weather, that is a ride that kills horses and the men on them." "I know," Nate said. "Nate," Evie said, "you are not going." He stopped with his hand on the wallet. "I am going," he said. "I am the only one on this ridge who has ridden to Laramie in a storm before. I did it in the war twice. I know the passes. I know where the trail goes under drifts. I am going." "All right," she said, "but I am going to give you 3 things before you leave this cabin." She unpinned her mother's cameo brooch from her own collar and pressed it into his hand. "That is the first. It is the only thing of my mother's I still have in this world, and it is going to come back to this ridge on your coat because you are going to come back to this ridge on your horse." And the second she said is this. She took his face in both her hands, and she stood up on her toes and she kissed him. A kiss that had 11 days of marriage in it and 3 weeks of coming to know him before that. A kiss that said, "Come home." And the third is my word, that Silas will still be breathing when you walk back through that door. Nate closed his hand around the cameo until the edges of it pressed into his palm. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He rode out of Thunder Ridge on the big roan gelding that had carried him through the last year of the war. The ride to Laramie and back took Nathaniel Reckoner 3 days. They were the 3 longest days of Evie's life. She did not leave the loft. She cooled Silas's forehead and his wrists and his chest, where the streaks of fever were climbing, and she talked to him in the voice she had once used for frightened schoolgirls on their first day at Miss Pemberton's. She told him about her mother's piano. She told him about the winterberry Gabriel had picked for her wedding. She told him that Hannah, wherever Hannah was, would not want him to follow her this way. On the morning of the second day, his fever broke for an hour, and he opened his eyes and he looked at Evie, and he said, "Perfectly clear, sister." "Yes," she said. He closed his eyes again and he slept a real sleep for the first time since the barn fire. Nate came back at the gray edge of the 3rd day. Gabriel heard the horse first. He knew the way the big roan carried its head, swung. It was too tired to lift it. Nate rode up to the porch of Thunder Ridge with ice in his beard and ice in his eyebrows, and the wool of his coat frozen stiff against his shoulders. He reached inside his coat and he pulled out a small brown bottle wrapped in an oiled cloth and a paper packet of powder, and he put them into Gabriel's hand. Upstairs, he said, "Go." Now, Gabriel went. Nate walked slow and stiff up the porch steps and through the cabin door. Evie was coming down the loft steps to meet him. She saw the cameo brooch still pinned to the inside of his coat collar where he had put it when he left. She walked across his cabin floor and she put her hands flat against his frozen chest and she pressed her forehead there. Nate's arms came up slow. He wrapped them around her. "I did not ride through that storm for my brother alone," he said, very quiet, his voice wrecked. "I rode because I could not stand the thought of you watching him die without me beside you. The whole 80 miles there and the whole 80 miles back, every time my horse tried to stop, the only thing that kept him moving was me saying your name out loud into his ear. I do not know what word I am supposed to use for that, Evelyn, but I rode 80 miles to say it to you in person." Evie lifted her face up to him. "Nate," she said, "the word is love. You do not have to find another one. You rode home to me in a blizzard and you carried my mother's brooch against your heart for 3 days, and the word for that is love." He closed his eyes. "Say it back to me," he said. "I love you, Nathaniel Reckoner," she said. "I have loved you since the night you put a flannel shirt over my shoulders. I just did not know the word for it until you came home." The fire in the stove cracked once. Outside, the snow kept falling, and Gabriel was already upstairs in the loft mixing the powders from the brown paper packet into warm water, and Silas Reckoner was going to live. Owen Blackwood came 3 mornings after Silas sat up in bed and asked for solid food. He came himself. He brought 6 hired men on 6 good horses, all of them armed, all of them paid in gold up front. He rode up the ridge trail at the first clean light of a cold morning with the sun behind him. Gabriel saw them coming from the ridge shoulder where he had been keeping watch since the barn fire. He came into the yard at a full gallop. "They are on the trail," he said. 6 riders and Blackwood. 20 minutes. Nate was already moving. "Silas," he said, even though Silas was still bandaged and still pale, "you are going to be found at the back door with the old Sharps rifle and a chair to sit in." Gabriel, the loft window on the north side. "Evie," he turned to his wife, "you are going to be on this porch with me and the Winchester I taught you on." "Yes," she said. There was no argument in her voice and no fear in it either. They did not have to wait long. But as Owen Blackwood's 6 hired men came up the last bend in the ridge trail into the clearing before the cabin, a second sound rose up behind them from further down the mountain. The sound of more horses. Many more horses. Blackwood reined up 20 feet from the porch and turned half in his saddle and saw coming up the ridge trail behind him in a long, steady column more than 20 riders from the Valley of Sweetwater. Old Tom Garrett rode at the front on his old bay with the Henry rifle that had been his father's across his saddle. Martha Winfield rode beside old Tom with a shotgun across her knees. Reverend Thomas Cole rode third, on a borrowed mule with no weapon at all, only his Bible in one hand. Behind the 3 of them came 12 more men of the valley. All of them had heard the story of the barn fire, and all of them had heard the story of Jasper Colt hanging in a locked cell with his hands tied behind his back. And all of them had come to an understanding about what kind of valley Sweetwater was going to be from this winter forward. Blackwood's face went the color of old ash. Nate stepped down off the porch, 1 step. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, "you came up my mountain today with 6 men to settle a thing that was already settled the night a woman I did not know walked through my door out of a blizzard. You should have stayed in Cheyenne." Blackwood's hand moved toward his coat. "Do not," Nate said. But Blackwood was a man who had always been told yes. His hand went inside his coat and it came out with a pistol, and the pistol came up, and the pistol did not come up aimed at Nate. It came up aimed at Evie, aimed at Shom. Evelyn Reckoner would remember what happened next in pieces rather than in order. She remembered the Winchester in her hands being steady. She remembered Nate's voice still calm, saying breathe out halfway and hold. She remembered the peach tin behind the barn and the feel of Nate's calloused hands over hers. She remembered the fire at the end of her finger. Owen Blackwood's horse reared and threw him hard into the trampled snow because Evelyn Reckoner's bullet had gone exactly where her husband had taught her to put it, which was clean through the top of Blackwood's shooting shoulder, and the pistol was gone from his hand before it ever came level. The 6 hired men froze. They looked at the woman on the porch. They looked at the 20 riders behind them. They put their hands up, all 6 of them at once. Old Tom Garrett rode up to Blackwood where he was rolling in the snow holding his shoulder. Owen, Old Tom said quietly, you should have let her be. Sheriff Amos Hale arrived from Sweetwater at a hard trot 15 minutes later because Martha Winfield had sent her youngest boy down the mountain ahead of the column. He looked at Blackwood in the snow. He looked at the 6 hired men. He looked at Evelyn Reckoner on the porch with the Winchester lowered in her hands. Ma'am, he said, touching the brim of his hat 1/2 inch. I am going to need a statement from you when you are ready, but it can wait until you have had a cup of coffee. He took Owen Blackwood to Cheyenne himself. The territorial court heard the case in the 2nd week of February. Sheriff Hale had spent the intervening days doing the quiet, patient work of a man who had been waiting years for a reason to put Owen Blackwood in front of a judge. 47 letters in Evie's carpet bag. A termination of agreement with Blackwood's own signature on it. The testimony of Reverend Thomas Cole. The testimony of Old Tom Garrett. A copy of Sarah Reckoner's original 61 homestead filing in her own maiden name. A sworn statement from the night clerk at the Sweetwater Hotel about who had been seen entering the back of the sheriff's office on the night Jasper Colt had died. The woman in the pearl gray silk, whose name turned out to be Cordelia Vance, and whose father was the president of the Merchants Bank of Denver, did not come to court. She sent a letter withdrawing her engagement, citing what she called an unfortunate incompatibility of character. The Merchants Bank of Denver withdrew its financing for the Transcontinental Western Railroad spur through Sweetwater Valley 2 days later, and the railroad company chose another valley for the line. Owen Blackwood was sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison at Laramie. He did not serve the full 20. He died of pneumonia in the 4th winter of his sentence, alone in a cold cell, and there was no one in Wyoming who mourned him. On the first warm afternoon of April, the snow finally came off the south face of Thunder Ridge. Evelyn Reckoner walked out behind the cabin, and she turned over the first small square of soil for a garden with a spade Silas had made for her at the forge. She planted winterberry at the corner for Gabriel. She planted sweet peas for her mother. She planted rosemary for her Aunt Josephine, who had died in a Boston parlor, not knowing that her niece was going to be all right after all. Nate came out while she was working and knelt beside her, and together, without speaking, they finished turning the rest of the row. Jonah Reckoner was born in the 2nd week of November of that year in the loft room, where Silas had almost died, with Martha Winfield acting as midwife, and Gabriel pacing the cabin floor, and Silas sitting by the stove with tears on his face that he did not bother to wipe away. Nate held his son for the first time with hands that were trembling, and he said quietly, "Welcome to Thunder Ridge, son. You are home." Gabriel married Martha Winfield under the big cottonwood by Sweetwater Creek in the spring of 1881. Martha wore the same gray dress with the patched elbows that she had worn to church the Sunday she had stood up for Evie. Gabriel's quiet half-smile, which had been living at the corner of his mouth for 38 years, finally had a reason to become a whole smile, and it did. Sarah Rose Reckoner was born to Nate and Evie that same summer. Silas was the one who rocked her to sleep on the porch in the long blue evenings of the high country. The years rolled. The hay barn was rebuilt stronger than before with a stone foundation Silas laid himself. The herd grew. The cabin gained 2 more rooms and a real porch that ran the full length of the south face. The schoolhouse at Sweetwater got a new roof paid for with the teachers' wages Evelyn Reckoner refused to take for herself. 30 winters after the one in which she had fallen through the door of Thunder Ridge, in the pale gold light of a December evening, In the year 1906, Evelyn Reckoner stood on the long south porch of the house her husband had built for her and watched her grandchildren chase each other through the dried grass of the yard below. She was 52 years old. Her honey-colored hair had gone silver at the temples and wheat at the ends. She wore a plain gray wool dress and her mother's cameo brooch at her throat because she had worn that brooch every day since the morning Nate had brought it home to her from Laramie in the pocket of his frozen coat. Nathaniel Reckoner came out of the cabin door behind her, slower than he used to move, 65 years old now, and more silver in his beard than brown, and he slid his arms around her shoulders, the way he had been doing every evening for 30 years. Down in the yard, Jonah Reckoner, 28 years old and tall as his father, was fixing a wagon wheel with his son at his elbow. Sarah Rose, 25 and married 2 years now, was sitting on the porch steps with her first baby on her lap. Gabriel and Martha's boys were chasing Silas's wolfhound across the far fence. Silas himself, 75 years old and white-haired and still the best blacksmith in 3 counties, was sitting in a chair by the garden gate with Sarah Rose's baby's tiny hand wrapped around his calloused finger. Nate said quietly into Evie's silver hair, "Do you ever regret the blizzard, Mrs. Reckoner?" Evie leaned her head back against her husband's chest, and she smiled a small, slow smile that she had been carrying inside her for 30 years. "I regret only," she said, "that I did not knock sooner. That was the day my life began." Nate closed his eyes for 1/2 second, and he breathed out slow. Below them, the winter sun dropped behind the shoulder of Thunder Ridge, and the sky turned the color of the inside of a peach tin, and the grandchildren were called in to supper, and the long south porch of the cabin held the 2 of them for one more quiet minute, and then the door opened behind them, and the warmth of the house reached out and took them in. The cabin on Thunder Ridge stood where it had always stood, thick-walled and stubborn, carved from the mountain itself. The fire inside it burned steady and warm, the way it had burned the night a young woman with ice in her lashes and a cameo brooch at her throat had knocked on its door out of a storm, and the door that had opened for her then and had kept opening for everyone who needed it, since stood ready to open again for whoever might come next, on whatever cold night might find them walking toward a single light on the shoulder of a mountain in the high country of Wyoming, looking for shelter from the storm.